We're going to move on to our next presenter, Gayatri Gopinath, who will be presenting a talk titled Unruliness, Suspension, Deviation. Gayatri Gopinath is an associate professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis and the director of the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality at New York University. She works at the intersection of transnational feminist and queer studies, post-colonial studies, and diaspora studies, and is the author of 2 monographs, Impossible Desires, Queer Diasporas and South Asian Public Cultures, published by Duke University Press in 2005, and Unruly Visions, The Aesthetic Practices of Queer Diaspora, also with Duke University Press, 2018. She has published numerous essays on gender, sexuality, and queer diasporic cultural production in journals such as Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, GLQ, Social Text, and Positions. Please help me to welcome Gayatri Gopinath. Thank you, Gayatri.
Thanks so much to the organizers and particularly to Hypatia for bringing us together. It's been an incredible day and it's hard to follow that performance. That was remarkable. Okay, so now for something completely different, but maybe there are actually echoes that you'll see. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my new book, Unruly Visions, and I'm drawing from different parts of it. I'm drawing from the introduction, as well as a particular chapter and then the epilogue. So I'm switching around a little bit, so bear with me. So you'll see that I begin with talking about a queer Lebanese artist, and then I go into a reading of a US independent film by a Latina filmmaker, and then I'll end again with the Lebanese artist. Okay, so here we go. And so what I'm going to try and do by threading these different pieces of the work together is to show you how these concepts of suspension, deviation, and unruliness are really central to the project. Okay. The image stopped me in my tracks. I know you, I thought, as I gazed at the black and white photograph from the early 1950s, captioned simply as Abed the Tailor. There was something in Abed's gaze, forthright, uncompromising, fierce, and the precise and delicate gesture of his hands framing his face that evoked the queer femme-aesthetic of the young queers of color I remember seeing on the Hudson River piers during my young adulthood in New York City in the early 90s. With his finely chiseled face, perfectly arched eyebrows, and elaborately coiffed hair, Abed was, to my contemporary gaze, immediately recognizable as a genderqueer figure. I first encountered this image while leafing through the 2004 co-edited book Hashem El-Madani Studio Practices by a Beirut-based Lebanese artist, Akram Zaatari. El-Madani was a studio photographer from Saidiya, Zaatari's hometown in southern Lebanon, and the book was created to coincide with the first exhibition of El-Madani's work in the UK, which Zaatari curated in London in 2004. El-Madani opened his photography studio in Saidiya in 1953, and over more than 50 years created hundreds of thousands of portraits of Saidiya's residents. There were brides and grooms, wrestlers and babies, resistance fighters and refugees. The portraits in Hashem El-Madani's studio practices date from the early 1950s to the mid-70s, and they tell of everyday life in the mid-20th century city. Zaatari's fascination with el-Madani's work stems from his general interest in the making of modernity in Lebanon, and specifically in the role of image-making practices such as studio photography in doing so. But of special interest to Zaatari is el-Madani as a chronicler of everyday life in South Lebanon per se, a region rendered other in relation to the larger Lebanese nation by successive waves of war and Israeli occupation between 1978 and 2000. In Hashim el-Madani's studio practices, Zaatari, in his dual role as artist and curator, reproduces and organizes specific images from el-Madani's vast collection that he finds especially significant and moving. It's striking, or at least it was striking to me, that of the hundreds and thousands of negatives in el-Madani's collection, a significant number of the images reprinted by Zaatari suggest some version of gender nonconformity of same-sex eroticism. This includes the image of Abed, a tailor, that I found so arresting. For me, encountering this image of Abed had a disruptive force. It suggests a radical swerving away, a deviation from the straight and narrow path of the aggressively gendered normativity connoted by the other photographs that surrounded it. But despite my initial visceral sense of familiarity upon encountering this image, the longer I gazed at the photograph, the further it receded. Given that a photograph can never act as a transparent or unmediated visual record of the past, the image of Abed the tailor cannot tell me who Abed really was, who or how he desired, or what his gender embodiment definitively meant to him or those around him. Rather, as my own initial shock of misrecognition suggests, Zaatari's representation of el-Madani's images activates trans-temporal relays of affective relationality between the subjects in the photographs, Zaatari, and other contemporary viewers, such as myself, that produce new meanings for these images as they circulate in the present. Zaatari curates el-Madani's images to do a specific kind of work, to tell an alternative history of the Lebanese nation in a minor key, so to speak, through foregrounding the queer desires and embodiments that suffused everyday life in mid-20th century Saidiya. I open with Zaatari's work and my initial responses to it as it exemplifies the interrelation of archive, region, affect, and aesthetics that is my central concern in Unruly Visions. Queer visual aesthetic practices function simultaneously as archival practices that suggest alternative understandings of time, space, and relationality that are obscured within dominant history. But as Zaatari's reanimation of el-Madani's portraits made clear, queer visual aesthetic practices also transform regional archives into queer archives. They bring into the field of vision the memory of quotidian forms of queerness and gender nonconformity that mark the space of the region as defined both supranationally and subnationally. Such practices thereby conjure forth what I term a queer regional imaginary that stands in contradistinction to a dominant national imaginary that effaces nonconforming bodies, desires, and affiliations. So throughout the book, I use the term queer regions and queer regional imaginary, and I'm defining the term in the book both subnationally and supranationally, and there's something interesting around the term region for me in its plasticity to mean both subnational and supranational. But in today's talk, I'm really just going to focus on the subnational valence of this concept of the region. Okay. So, switching gears a little bit. So we can clearly see the contours of a queer regional imaginary if we turn to the 2012 independent feature film Mosquita y Mari by the US, and in fact Los Angeles-based queer Latina filmmaker Aurora Guerrero. The film frames the subnational space of the region, in this case Southern California's immigrant landscape, as the site for a radical repudiation of the developmental logic of both a gay and immigrant progress narrative. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. We can read the film itself as a form of queer memoir, as an excavation and archiving of queerness as it emerges in the specificity of this particular regional location. The film is emblematic of what I'm calling the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora. These are aesthetic practices that negotiate diasporic movement and different spatial scales and suggest other possibilities of being in and moving through these spaces that deviate from the straight lines of hetero and homonormative scripts that typically determine one's life trajectory. These practices illuminate modes of queer critique and non-compliance that are unspectacular and banal, woven into the fabric of everyday life. They traffic not so much in bold assertions of identity, such as coming out as queer or as immigrant or as undocumented, for instance, but rather in those forms of queer world-making that allow us to apprehend new modes of being oriented in the world. The injunction that one's life be directed and oriented in a particular way towards a recognized social good, as Sarah Ahmed puts it, is powerfully contested by these aesthetic practices. They disarrange the temporal and spatial logic of conventional articulations of aspirational success, home, and family, enjoined by the nation-state and replicated within mainstream and gay immigrant narratives. This is a logic that is predicated on the straight line forward, away from a closeted or impoverished past, and towards a future that promises normative kinship structures and property ownership, economic and social uplift, and recognition, intelligibility, and inclusion within the public sphere. In contrast, the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora point the way to alternative modes of inhabiting time and space, of relationality and affiliation, of success and making it, that are in fact unintelligible within this developmental logic. Queer desire, relationality, and identification function as a kind of propulsive force that throws one off a normative life course and into a different life trajectory that is in fact open-ended with no fixed itinerary or ending. So this chapter in the book, just to give you a sense, give you a little bit of context, is really about how, in order to confront the extreme anti-immigrant rhetoric that we see coming out of the US, immigrant rights advocates often appeal to a kind of respectability politics that's all about normative notions of family and kinship. And this is what we also see replicated in a kind of mainstream gay rights movement in the US that's argued for inclusion through a recourse to normative family structures such as gay marriage, for instance, right? And so what I'm trying to say is that these aesthetic practices of queer diaspora that I'm looking at offer us another vision of relationality, right? Another vision of affiliation and directionality that is quite distinct from these sort of progress narratives and developmental narratives that emerge both out of a kind of mainstream immigrant and gay imagination. Okay. So the film's website describes Mosquita y Mari as a coming-of-age story of two young Latinas, Mari and Yolanda, whom Mari nicknames Mosquita, set in a working-class Latino enclave named Huntington Park in Los Angeles. Guerrero traces in exquisite detail the feeling, both the sense of possibility and the deadening strictures of being located in this particular minor, tangential, off-center location. That Guerrero chooses to situate her story in Huntington Park rather than in the more recognizable and frequently represented Latino areas of Los Angeles is significant. In response to an interviewer's query on why she chose this particular setting, she comments, quote, "East LA has been played out so much in films. It's gone to a point where people across the nation and even the world think of East LA to be the only Latino community in California. Nothing against East LA, but I wanted to capture a community just west of East LA that has its own unique history and vibe. I want to bring Huntington Park out of the shadows." The film immediately situates the viewer in the specificity of this terrain just west of East LA. Against a backdrop of a poisoned, polluted landscape, replete with endless highways and electrical lines, factories and toxic sunsets, Mosquita y Mari beautifully captures the drama and intensity of adolescent female friendship. This is a moment when the lines between homosociality and homoeroticism are porous and labile, and when desire has not yet congealed into categories of identity. Guerrero has said in interviews that she wanted to make the film to document her own experience of first love, a way of marking the genealogical beginnings of her own formation as a queer Latina. She comments, quote, "Mosquita and Mari's story is meant to capture the moments that, maybe down the line, maybe in college, they will come to discover were their first moments of queerness," end quote. One could read Guerrero's comment as suggesting a straightforward gay developmental narrative, where one's nascent gay identity is revealed and discovered through a backward glance from the vantage point of a fully formed gay adulthood. But in fact, the film exceeds a straightforward politics of visibility and the attendant stability of queer selfhood implied by the language of coming out. Indeed, the film eschews a linear narrative arc. Instead, Mosquita y Mari is finely attuned to the subtle, circular, quotidian rhythms and patterns of existence as minor, both as a minor and in a minor space, but also as undocumented, as poor, as female, as racialized, as migrant. Indeed, not much happens in the film. It begins and ends in the unremarkable middle, the middle of adolescence, itself a temporary, temporal space, the middle of the small and anti-monumental pleasures and struggles that give texture and meaning to the everyday. Capturing the scrambled temporality and shifting sense of scale of both queerness and adolescence, the camera lingers in slow motion on the seemingly inconsequential detail, dust particles hitting the light, a hand silhouetted against the sun, strands of Mari's hair floating in the wind. Belying the apparent modesty and intimate scale of their concerns, the lives of the protagonists are indelibly marked by multiple histories of US empire, racialization, and neoliberal globalization. It's significant that Huntington Park was initially an aggressively all-white neighborhood that by the mid-1990s, due to successive waves of deindustrialization, had transformed into a predominantly working-class Latino neighborhood made up of two different Latino demographics. Second or third generation Mexican-American families from East LA in search of upward mobility, and new migrants increasingly impoverished and displaced by neoliberal economic policies in Mexico. The circumstances that created Huntington Park as a working-class Latino community are mirrored in the circumstances of the protagonists themselves. Mari is undocumented, her truck driver father is dead, and so she helps to support her younger sister and single mother, a factory laborer, by attempting to insert herself into the informal exchange economy of the street. She is shown constantly looking for work, and one of her jobs is to pass out flyers for a photography studio that specializes in family portraits that produce and consolidate a normative nuclear family structure within which Mosquita is firmly embedded, but that is emphatically outside of Mari's own reach. Mosquita is a straight-A student and the sole daughter of first-generation Mexican immigrants who constantly impress upon Mosquita the importance of making it through hard work and education as a way to beat back the poverty that lies just beyond the doors of their neat and orderly home. At one point, as Mosquita's grades start slipping as her friendship with Mari deepens, the family silently drives by homeless and destitute vendors on the side of the road, prompting Mosquita's father to gravely tell her, quote, "We don't have to go to Mexico to be reminded of what poverty looks like. It's just a few blocks away from us. Your mother and I work very hard to make sure your future is far away from this," end quote. For Mosquita's parents, the family is seen as a bulwark, indeed the sole protection against the forces of economic precarity that threaten to engulf them. For them, the only possible motion is forwards and upwards, away from Mexico, away from poverty and the perils of a perpetually unsecured life. Lauren Berlant notes that exhaustion is one of the primary affects of neoliberalism, and in Mosquita y Mari, exhaustion saturates the texture of the everyday. Mosquita's parents are shown passed out in front of the television after a long day's work, while the 15-year-old Mari is repeatedly exhausted by the daily business of survival. Estoy cansada, I'm tired, she quietly tells her mother after engaging in an incipient form of sex work to help pay the bills. Early on in the film, the two girls stand on a rooftop and gaze out over the toxic landscape that is their world, as Mosquita tells Mari, a newcomer to Huntington Park, I hope you like Huntington Park. Sometimes it smells like pan dulce, sometimes it smells like chemicals, unquote. Mosquita's comment is an astute observation on how working-class communities of color often bear the brunt of environmental degradation, even as they create rich social worlds of immigrant life and culture. This is a landscape replete with what Rob Nixon terms slow violence, a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence, as Nixon puts it, that is typically not viewed as violence at all. It is precisely the forms of slow-moving violence, the unspectacular, accretive, and quotidian brutalities that are visited upon bodies, psyches, and landscapes within neoliberalism that the film captures through its stretched-out present. While the girls exist in a landscape characterized by various forms of stasis, punctuated by the ever-present threat of downward mobility, they create their own circuits of sideways movement through the exchange of various objects that both enable and mediate an erotic bodily intimacy between the two. Mosquita licks an ice cream cone and passes it to Mari. Mari inhales from a joint and exhales the smoke onto Mosquita's face. Mari removes the earphones of her CD player, her most prized possession, from her own ears and bequeaths them to Mosquita. The anachronistic quality of the CD player, which Mari proudly calls a classic, signals the scrambled temporality and alternative life worlds that queer relationality enables. In one key scene, which I'll show you, Mosquita dances in front of the mirror in her parents' bedroom. She is subtly entranced by her own image as she dons her father's hat and listens to ranchera music on Mari's CD player. The music transports her into a queer world that she shares with Mari, but it also harkens back to another time and place, a there and then of an imagined Mexico prior to her parents' migration, rather than the here and now of Huntington Park. Mosquita's reverie is rudely interrupted by her mother, who walks into the room and demands that Mosquita hand over the CD player. As the mother places the earphones in her own ears, she too is momentarily drawn into a circuit of queer exchange as she begins to move to the music and invites Mosquita to dance with her. So let me just, hopefully I will be able to show this to you. Sorry, I need my glasses to see where we're at. Help me with this. I need to get it to like 33 minutes and around 25 seconds. Okay, that's fine. Let's just do that.
Yolanda. ¿Qué haces, mija? Te metiste en el closet de tu padre. ¿Y esos?
Me lo prestaron.
A ver, presta. ¿Bailamos?
¿Qué, mamá?
Llévalo al closet de tu padre.
¿Cómo fue cuando conociste a mi papá? Cuando bailaron por la primera vez.
¿De qué hablas?
Usted sabe cosas de la vida.
Te hemos dicho perfectamente que lo único que te tiene que preocupar es la escuela. Concéntrate en eso. No ando en chinga todo el día para que tú lo eches todo a perder.
Le estaba haciendo una pregunta.
I wish we could watch the whole thing. It's really lovely. This is a lovely moment in the film, a brief intimation of queer couplehood between the mother and daughter within the space of the immigrant home itself. But this moment is abruptly cut short, as you saw, as the mother catches a glimpse of herself in the mirror and calls a halt to the scene. She brusquely brushes off Mosquita's plea that she relate what life was like with Mosquita's father before they migrated, by sternly stating that the only thing Mosquita needs to concern herself with is her schoolwork. The scene speaks to the mother's insistence on the here and now, a repudiation of the past and of her former self that is also obliquely a repudiation of the glimpse of queer desire and alternative relationality that she spies in the mirror. Thus, the queerness of the scene is not simply in the momentary coming together of mother and daughter into a queer couple form that shadows the real queer couple of Mosquita and Mari. Rather, the queerness of the scene also resides in its evocation of another time and place through both sound and bodily movement. Faced with the sensorial evocation of this other temporality, not here, not now, and its juxtaposition with the grimness of the here and now, Mosquita's mother can only respond by attempting to forestall it. As Mosquita's parents demonstrate, one response to the everyday trauma and deadening strictures of an unsecured life is to shore up the family structure and to compulsively adhere to normative notions of success that espouse only forward and upward momentum. But this is not a response available to Mari even if she desired it. Significantly, as you see here, the shot that follows the scene in the bedroom is that of Mari on the street as she passes out flyers, gazing at Mosquita's family photograph that is displayed in the window of the photography studio. Being undocumented means that Mari necessarily inhabits a different temporality than that which is seemingly available to Mosquita. When Mari's mother admonishes her for not caring about education, Mari responds that she's already figured out, quote, "It's having a green card that gets you an education," end quote. And a green card is what gives you legal status, permanent legal status in the United States. Later in the film, when Mari is threatened with suspension after being caught smoking pot in the school bathroom, Mosquita asks her plaintively, "But what about college?" "A waste of time," Mari retorts. Being undocumented, in fact, situates Mari in a perpetual state of suspension, another temporality within which she has no recourse to the pathways to normative success. Indeed, this state of suspension resonates with the testimonies of undocumented youth activists in the US who speak of existing in a state of perpetual waiting, of being stuck in limbo, of feeling like their lives are on pause. Queerness, I would argue, allows for an alternative state of suspension, one that resists the forward and upward directionality of normative visions of aspirational success. Unlike the stuck or stalled temporality that marks the state of being undocumented, queerness offers another pathway through precarity, one that may be contingent, momentary, and tentative, but that nevertheless opens up a different vista of what constitutes success and making it. Queer desire and relationality take place in the film in those in-between, dead-end, wasted, or anachronistic spaces that are produced by the merciless logic of a neo-capitalist order, and that are seemingly without mobility or use value within this logic. On Mari's bicycle that they ride around in circles, in a stationary car they can't drive, on the roof of a broken-down car, along disused train tracks that they follow home on the way from on the way home from school, in an abandoned garage that is their primary site of escape and fantasy. Here, Mosquita helps Mari master the art of geometry, tutoring her on the theorems and equations that provide a sense of order, stability, and predictability to Mosquita's world. But the incursion of queer desire and attachment between the two girls provides another kind of geometry to their lives, negating the equation that renders the attainment of the good life synonymous with the privileges of heteronormativity. Here, in the burnt-out garage, Mari relates to Mosquita her memory of another time and place, her moments with her grandmother in Mexico when she was 5 years old, prior to her migration to the US. 10 years from now, she tells Mosquita, I'm going to save up and visit my grandma in Jalapa, Mexico. By then, who cares if I can't make it back? 10 years from now, I bet you'll be a doctor or a lawyer, or maybe you'll be a truck driver. You can take me to my grandma's. You can stay if you want, unquote. In Mari's fantasy of queer domesticity, the triangulated geometry of the prototypical immigrant family of mother, father, and child is restructured into a queer geometry of affiliation of Mari's grandmother, Mosquita, and Mari. This, then, is Mari's queer genealogy, one that is rooted in and through Jalapa, Mexico, and that indeterminate minor site just west of East LA, that is Huntington Park. The garage, that space of disuse and detritus, becomes a site of what Jose Munoz terms queer utopian memory. Mari's backward glance enacts a future vision of queer relationality that rewrites the standard immigrant narrative that is structured around forward momentum away from the past, away from Mexico, and into the lockdown present of kinship normativity. Thus, Guerrero offers us routes through and to queerness that veer off course from the hetero and homonormative life paths to upward mobility and making it that are enshrined in conventional visions of immigrant success. These are visions enjoined by the US nation state as it structures the racialized immigrant family. The aesthetic practices of queer diaspora instead suggest other geometries of descent and affiliation that rupture and transform these visions of both gay and immigrant respectability. The moments of suspension, the circular, meandering trajectories that these practices engender are rooted in and through the region, in the specificity of minor, non-metronormative regional locations, such as that area just west of East LA. So to conclude, I want to segue to the epilogue, which is entitled Crossed Eyes Towards a Queer-Sided Vision, and this is where I think there may be a connection to the performance that we just saw. So this returns us to the work of Akram Zaatari, with which I began. I end with a portrait dating from the 1950s, one of the photographs that Zaatari selects to reprint from Hashim al-Madani's vast collection of negatives documenting everyday life in South Lebanon. This isn't one of the more obviously queer images. It's actually a portrait of a small boy, looking somewhat befuddled, bewildered in fact, dressed in shorts and a white shirt. He appears to be holding his eyes as still and as wide open as possible, perhaps at al-Madani's urging. Nevertheless, he is unmistakably cross-eyed as he gazes simultaneously forward toward the viewer and sideways towards the edge of the frame. In the caption that accompanies this image, al-Madani writes, quote, "Other photographers used to send me negatives of cross-eyed people, asking me to retouch them. I used to scratch out the emulsion where the pupil is and draw another one in right next to it," end quote. Madani's cross-eyed clients provided him with a particular challenge, and he would often go to quite elaborate lengths to create images of them that he deemed acceptable. He describes, for instance, how he would have his cross-eyed clients look at different numbers marked along the length of a wooden stick that he would place outside the camera frame. While Madani came to become somewhat of an expert at normalizing the gaze of his cross-eyed clients, in this particular image, the boy's gaze remains flagrantly uncorrected. It seems fitting that I end with this image of uncorrected, unruly vision that veers off tangent, as it characterizes much of the work I discuss in the book. The dictionary defines the condition of being cross-eyed, technically termed strabismus, from the Greek root strabos, or squinting, as a disorder of vision due to a deviation from normal orientation of one or both eyes, so that both cannot be directed at the same object at the same time. The deviant orientation of crossed eyes, then, connotes both aberrant temporality and directionality through an attraction to multiple objects. Interestingly, the Kenyan Indian artist Alan D'Souza, whose work I write about throughout the book, writes about undergoing surgery to correct strabismus in an autobiographical essay. For D'Souza, strabismus is particularly stigmatizing and a source of shame when being judged and measured by the normalizing gaze of others. He writes, "People tend to assume strabismus is a sign of mental illness or mental incapacity, especially in black or brown bodies, and they treat you accordingly. Then they won't look you in the face because they're embarrassed." My hope is that this book demonstrates how unruly vision can open up other ways of seeing and sensing the world that are unimaginable through a normative lens. Indeed, D'Souza comments that following his surgery, he would play games with his disjunctive vision. One favorite amusement is a variation of that old ventriloquist trick. While drinking from a cup, I look directly with one eye into the cup, and with the other eye, I watch the room. I can then superimpose two images so that the room looks like it's underwater. Not only do I conflate time, I can now conflate space. This conflation of time and space that D'Souza describes precisely characterizes the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora. These practices allow for, and indeed demand, the unruly mode of vision that I call a queer optic. This queer optic deviates from a forward-looking directionality and instead veers towards multiple objects, spaces, and temporalities simultaneously. Indeed, we can understand the phrase crossed eyes to reference the crossings and encounters of numerous eyes, the letter I, the radical relationality of multiple subjectivities that constitute and at times interrupt one another. And this is maybe going back to Amber's talk around the plurality of the self. In Zaatari's Hashim al-Madani's studio practices, for instance, the hyper-masculine freedom fighter and the effeminate tailor are not antithetical to one another in terms of representing opposite ends along a spectrum of normative masculinity. Rather, they are intimately connected in Zaatari's queer transtemporal imagination. Thus, the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora deploy queer desire, affect, and affiliation as conduits to excavate not only the violences of the past, but its forgotten possibilities. As a film like Mosquita y Mari attests to, these aesthetic practices also demand that we become attuned to the sideways and circular motions, the swerves and deviations, the states of suspension that provide a glimpse of alternative social orders and political imaginaries. If the conceptual categories of nation, diaspora, and the global skew gigantic, the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora, as we see in a film like Mosquita y Mari, bring into focus the regional and the particular, the small and the tangential, the mundane and the personal, the fragmentary and the discarded. They demand that we, as viewers, readers, spectators, and listeners, place in the same frame apparently radically dissimilar objects so as to become attuned to the resonances between them. And now I'm thinking of Hypatia's beautiful framing of resonance at the beginning of the day. The alternative cartographies suggested by Zadari's and Guerrero's remappings of the region suggest different forms of relationality that may in fact reorient our vision towards more capacious and hospitable futures. Thank you.